Iran's crackdown has gone beyond arrests and violence. Senior hardline clerics are now calling for executions of protesters and openly threatening foreign leaders. What does this escalation reveal about the regime's strategy, and what could it mean for Iran's future? As protests in Iran have slowed under a brutal security crackdown, the rhetoric coming from the country's clerical establishment has taken a sharply more aggressive turn. In recent days, key hardline religious figures have publicly called for harsh punishments, including executions, for those they label as opponents of the state, fueling both domestic fear and international concern. At the center of this surge in hardline language is Ayatollah Ahmad Hatami, a senior cleric and prominent voice within Iran's conservative religious leadership. In a nationally broadcast sermon, Hatami called for punitive action against detainees accused of participating in the protests, framing them as enemies of the state and of the Islamic system. He invoked the concept of those worthy of execution, a charge rooted in strict interpretations of Islamic law used to justify severe penalties against dissenters. Hatami's comments were not just directed at protesters inside Iran. In the same speech, he issued a direct threat to former U.S. President Donald Trump, a dramatic escalation in rhetoric that illustrates how intertwined the internal dynamics of the protests have become with broader geopolitical tensions. While the exact context and phrasing varied in state-controlled media, the message was unmistakably defiant. Both domestic dissent and perceived foreign interference would be met with uncompromising resistance. This hardline stance comes amid an already severe crackdown. Authorities have deployed security forces across major cities, maintained a near-total internet blackout, and arrested thousands of people suspected of involvement in the protests. Rights groups estimate that the lethal force used by security forces has led to thousands of deaths, although independent verification has been extremely difficult due to restricted access. For many Iranians and international observers, the clerical calls for executions represent more than rhetorical tough talk. In Iran's legal system, certain charges laid against protesters such as mohareb or waging war on God can carry the death penalty. Courts, influenced by political pressures, have in some cases moved swiftly to impose capital punishment on individuals accused of violent acts during unrest. Critics of the regime are alarmed that such judicial processes lack transparency and due process. Human rights organizations have highlighted cases where individuals, including a young Iranian soldier who reportedly refused orders to fire on protesters, were sentenced to death, drawing international condemnation and calls for accountability. The hardline rhetoric and legal measures also serve a broader political objective, sending a clear message of deterrence. By publicly threatening executions and framing dissidents as enemies of both religion and the state, the regime seeks to intimidate potential challengers and discourage further dissent. Domestically, this can create a chilling effect, dissuading civilians and activists from returning to the streets out of fear for their lives. Internationally, it positions Iran's leadership as unyielding and resistant to external pressure or interference. Yet this posture carries risks. Escalation into executions, especially of civilians, could deepen Iran's isolation on the world stage. Countries and international bodies that have so far condemned lethal crackdowns may respond with expanded sanctions, diplomatic reprisals, or increased support for human rights investigations. Such responses could further strain Iran's already fragile economy and diplomatic standing. Within Iran, the use of capital punishment against dissenters may deepen the divide between the state and segments of society that have already been alienated by years of economic hardship and political repression. Even if large-scale street protests have subsided due to the crackdown, anger and resentment can simmer below the surface, manifesting in different forms of opposition or underground movements. The intersection of religion, politics, and law in Iran's response to dissent is complex. Hardline clerics carry significant influence in shaping both public discourse and legal policy, often aligning closely with security organs to preserve the theological foundations of the state. Their calls for executions reflect not just a punitive impulse, but an effort to defend the ideological framework of Iran's leadership as what they perceive as existential threats. In this context, the escalation of rhetoric and legal threats underscores how serious the regime views the protests, not merely as an outbreak of unrest, but as a deep challenge to its authority. In summary, the emergence of clerical calls for executions amid Iran's protest crisis marks a deeply troubling escalation. While large public demonstrations have slowed under intense repression, the regime's rhetoric and legal maneuvers signal a determination to silence dissent at almost any cost. As Iran navigates this critical moment, the world will be watching closely, not only for changes on the streets, but for the implications of an internal system willing to pursue the harshest punishments against its own people. Understanding these developments is vital, because in times of crisis, what leaders say can shape both fear and resistance. Stay informed and stay aware, because these stories affect not just Iran, but global conversations about human rights, power, and justice.